Northern Highlands. The wind carried ice through the valley, mixing with the smell of pine smoke and frozen earth. It was the kind of night where nothing moved unless it had to. Wolves gathered in the central marketplace, drawn by the promise of debt settled, deals made, and something darker, something that made even the hardest among them shift uncomfortably in the torchlight. Hello friends. Before we journey deeper into Naira's story, I invite you to subscribe and share in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence here matters. Now, let's continue. Her name was Naira, 24 years old. Worn leather dress stained at the edges, dark hair tangled and unwashed, hands bound in front of her with silver-threaded rope that bound her wrists like brands. Her father shoved her onto the stone platform in the center of the square, rough hands treating her like cargo being unloaded. She can cook, clean, and keep her mouth shut, he announced to the pack, his voice carrying across the frozen air. Whoever's got the coin can claim her tonight. The crowd didn't laugh. Not out loud. But the silence between the low growls and whispered assessments was worse. Eyes glowed amber and gold in the firelight, circling, evaluating, hungry. Naira stood there, the cold biting through her thin dress, but the shame beneath it burned hotter than any winter wind. She's Barren, her father added, lifting her left wrist to display the healer's brand, a broken moon symbol seared into her pale flesh. The mark every wolf recognized. The mark of worthlessness. Tested by 3 healers over 2 years. Nothing. But she's still young enough, still got use in her. Strong back. Quiet disposition. Naira didn't beg. She'd done that before. Once when her betrothed had rejected their bond after 2 years of failed attempts. Once when his claws had found her throat during his final rage. It hadn't mattered then, so she stood in silence now, gaze fixed on the frozen ground. Near the edge of the gathering, her mother stood wrapped in a grey wool shawl, eyes fixed on the stone beneath her feet, lips pressed into a bloodless line. She didn't speak. Didn't intervene. Didn't even look up. And when the murmuring began, when hands reached for coin purses, her mother turned and slipped away into the shadows, head low, shoulders hunched, swallowed by the darkness like she'd never come to witness her daughter's sale at all. Like Naira had already ceased to exist. The main gate groaned open. Arctic wind rushed through the marketplace, extinguishing several torches. Conversations died mid-word. Every head turned. A man stepped through the gateway, towering, broad-shouldered, fur-lined cloak heavy with fresh snow. The firelight caught the silver streaks threading through his long dark hair and illuminated the network of scars crossing his weathered face. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator that had never known fear. The air itself seemed to shift around him, charged with ancient power. He smelled of leather, steel, winter storms, and something else, old blood and older authority. He didn't ask her name. Didn't circle the platform like the others had been doing. Didn't examine her teeth or test her reflexes or discuss her potential value. He simply walked directly to the elder's table, reached inside his cloak, and dropped a heavy leather pouch that landed with the unmistakable weight of gold. No haggling. No questions. No negotiation. The marketplace fell into deathly silence. Every wolf present recognized him. Some lowered their heads instinctively. Others took unconscious steps backward. Her father's eyes went wide, his face draining of color. Alpha King Draven. I didn't expect. The girl's debt isn't that. How much does she? The voice that answered was quiet. The kind of quiet that made grown wolves stop breathing. The kind that preceded violence. It's not her debt. Storm gray eyes finally lifted, pinning her father like an insect to a board. It's yours. I believe I made myself clear about gambling debts in my territory 6 months ago. Her father swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. He named the amount anyway, voice shaking. Draven didn't blink. Didn't look toward Naira. The debt is paid. Remove yourself from these mountains. If I see your face again, I'll remove it permanently. He turned and walked toward the gate, cloak sweeping behind him like shadow given form. Naira didn't move. The crowd had already begun to scatter, unwilling to draw the Alpha King's attention. No one cared where she went now. Her fate had been decided. Her father gave her one final shove, nearly knocking her off the platform. Go on. You're his now. Try not to shame us further. She bent to retrieve her small cloth satchel, just a worn journal from her grandmother, a wooden comb with missing teeth, and a single pressed moonflower, brittle with age, and followed the stranger through the snow on unsteady legs. Beyond the marketplace, a black carriage waited, ornate and ancient, pulled by two massive wolves whose eyes glowed like embers. Steam rose from their flanks despite the freezing temperature. Naira climbed inside with trembling hands, the silver burns on her wrists throbbing with each movement. The Alpha King slid into the seat across from her without a word, filling the small space with his presence. She didn't know his name was Draven Stormpeak, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of 7 mountain packs, widower, and father to 4 motherless cubs. Not yet. Not really. A scarred warrior in the driver's seat glanced back, one eye clouded with old injury. Where to, my king? Home. The carriage lurched forward. The mountain landscape began scrolling past the frosted window, jagged peaks pacing cloud cover, ancient forests dark as memory, snow falling in thick curtains. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. Naira studied his face when moonlight flickered through the window. He wasn't old, but violence and grief had carved their history into every line and scar. 40 winters, perhaps. His hands rested on his knees, one bearing claw marks that had healed badly, the other wrapped in fresh bandages that seeped crimson at the edges. No bonding mark on his throat. No lunar scent clinging to his clothes. Only the smell of loneliness and snow. Why did you pay for me? She finally asked, not expecting an answer. He didn't look at her immediately. When he did, his eyes were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. 4 cubs, he said, voice like distant thunder. No mother. No time to raise them properly. Her throat tightened. So I'm a nursemaid? No. Something flickered across his scarred face, something that might have been pain. Just someone who isn't cruel. That's all they need now. The carriage came to a stop before a fortress that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. Massive grey stone walls rose toward the night sky, watchtowers silhouetted against clouds, iron gates thick enough to withstand siege engines. This wasn't the gleaming palace Naira had imagined from childhood stories. This was a war fortress, ancient, formidable, built to endure. Snow blanketed the courtyard in unmarked white. Faint golden light seeped from narrow windows cut into thick walls, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys, curling into the frozen air like spirits ascending. Draven stepped out first, not waiting, not looking back. Naira pushed open her own door and followed him through the snow. Her thin boots sank deep with each step. The cold bit through the worn leather, numbing her toes within seconds. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands and wolf head knockers, swung open. Warmth rushed out like an embrace after years of cold. Inside, the fortress was surprisingly lived in. Weapons lined the stone walls in organized rows. Fires covered the floors. A great hearth blazed in the center of the main hall, its fire reflected in polished shields and battle-worn armor. Draven stopped in the stone entryway. His voice was curt, efficient. Your chamber is in the east wing, 3rd door past the tapestry of the first Alpha King. Kitchens are through the great hall. Don't enter the war room or the western tower. Then he disappeared into the shadows of a side corridor, boot steps echoing on stone until silence swallowed them completely. Naira stood alone in the entry hall, clutching her small satchel, listening to the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. She hadn't even taken a step when a voice cut through the quiet. Who did father bring home this time? A boy of 14 stood at the top of the stone staircase, arms folded across his chest, eyes evaluating her with suspicion that belonged on someone twice his age. His dark hair was cut short. His jaw was set hard. His stance was defensive, protective. That was Kale, the eldest. Naira recognized it immediately. He had Draven's eyes, sharp and grey and weary. Another caretaker who'll run away when things get difficult, Kale continued, descending 3 steps, each footfall deliberate. How long do you think you'll last? 2 weeks? 5 days? In the corner near the great hearth, another boy sat hunched over a massive leather-bound book, the kind used for recording pack histories. Roan, 11 years old, with lighter hair and his mother's delicate features. He glanced at Naira for exactly 1 second, took in her threadbare dress and silver-burned wrists, then returned to his reading as though she'd already proven unworthy of further attention. Behind a thick wooden pillar carved with ancient runes, a pair of wide golden eyes peered out. Lyra, 8 years old, blonde hair uncombed and tangled with small twigs, clutching a stuffed wolf toy that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. The little girl's gaze was full of fear and something else, desperate hope fighting against experience. And on the floor near the fire, arranging wooden soldiers in battle formation, sat the youngest. Ash, barely 6 years old, with hair so light it was almost white and eyes that still held innocence the others had lost. Another one. Kale's voice dripped with practiced disdain as he reached the bottom of the stairs. Father's brought 3 before you. The first lasted 2 weeks before she complained about the isolation. The second lasted 5 days before Roan's nightmares drove her away. The last one left in the middle of the night without even collecting her pay. Naira found her voice. I'm not. Save it. Kale cut her off with a sharp gesture. We don't need you. We've managed fine on our own. We know how to cook, how to clean, how to survive. We don't need another stranger pretending to care until it gets too hard. Roan spoke without looking up from his book, his voice carrying across the stone hall with unexpected clarity. Father means well. But he doesn't understand that we're not the problem. Adults are. They see 4 damaged cubs and a lonely king, and they think they can fix us. They can't. Little Lyra whispered something to her stuffed wolf, pressing her face against its worn fur, retreating further behind the pillar. Ash looked up from his soldiers, tilting his head with pure childhood curiosity. Are you going to be our new mama? The entire hall froze. Kale went rigid, his hands clenching into fists. Roan's fingers stilled on the page he'd been turning. Lyra made herself smaller, as though trying to disappear into the stone itself. From somewhere in the dark corridor, Naira heard footsteps stop. Draven had heard. She knew he had. She knelt down slowly until she was level with Ash's round, hopeful eyes. Her voice came out softer than she'd expected. I'm not a new mama, but I can be your friend. Would that be okay? Ash considered this with the seriousness only children possess. Then he nodded, accepting it as easily as children accept that the sun rises and the moon follows. Okay. Friends is good. But the older ones did not accept. Kale's jaw tightened. He turned abruptly and strode up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. We don't need anyone, he called back, voice rough with emotions he refused to name. The slam of a door echoed through the fortress like a judge's gavel. Draven reappeared in the entryway, his face unreadable. He pointed toward the staircase without looking at Naira. Your room is upstairs. Marta will show you. A weathered woman emerged from the kitchen corridor as though summoned, grey-haired, stone-faced, wearing a stained apron over practical wool. Her hands were calloused from decades of work, her eyes sharp with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. Come along then, Marta said, her voice gruff but not unkind. Best get you settled before the cubs decide whether to trust you or torment you. Naira followed her up the winding stone staircase, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and wolf hunts, past doorways where she could feel the cubs watching from shadows. Kale's door was closed tight. Roan had retreated to his room with his book. Lyra's door stood open just a crack, one golden eye visible in the darkness. Here. Marta stopped at a plain wooden door. Not luxury, but it's warm and the roof doesn't leak. More than some have. The room was small but clean. A narrow bed with a wool blanket. A wooden chest at the foot. A small window overlooking the snowy forest beyond the fortress walls. A clay washbasin on a stand. A single candle on the windowsill. Someone had prepared for her arrival. Someone had known she was coming. Meals are at dawn, midday, and dusk, Marta said, her tone businesslike. Cubs eat in the great hall when they feel like eating, which isn't often enough. King eats alone in his study, when he eats at all. Laundry is Tuesdays and Fridays. Kitchen work is shared, though I do most of it since the last girl left. Questions? What happened to their mother? Marta's expression hardened into granite. That's not your business. Don't ask the king. Don't ask the cubs. You're here to help with practical matters, not to dig into wounds that haven't healed. Understand? I understand. Good. Marta turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. One more thing. The cubs have been hurt enough. If you're going to leave, do it now. Don't make them care about you first. She left, closing the door firmly behind her. Naira sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still wearing her thin traveling dress. The silver bones on her wrists throbbing with each heartbeat. Through the window, she could see the forest stretching endlessly into darkness, ancient pines heavy with snow. Somewhere in the fortress, she heard a child crying, muffled, trying to hide it, heartbreaking in its restraint. Then silence. She opened her satchel with trembling hands and took out the pressed moonflower her grandmother had given her years ago. Its petals were brittle as paper, nearly dust, but she held it carefully between her palms anyway. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered to the empty room. The candle flame flickered. Outside, a wolf howled, long, mournful, utterly alone. Naira didn't sleep that night. She sat at the window, watching snow fall on a fortress full of broken hearts, and wondered if she had enough pieces of herself left to help mend anyone else. Dawn arrived without mercy. Naira woke to the sound of howling, not wolves, but wind tearing through the mountain peaks like claws through fabric. She dressed quickly in the plain grey dress Marta had left folded on the chest, her fingers fumbling with the ties as cold seeped through the stone walls. The great hearth was already blazing when she reached the kitchens. Marta worked with aggressive efficiency, her hands moving through dough like she was punishing it for existing. "You're late," Marta said without turning around. "I wasn't told when." "Dawn means before the sun clears the mountains." She thrust a woven basket at Naira, eggs rattling inside. "Make breakfast for the cubs. They eat in the hall in 20 minutes. Don't burn it." Naira had cooked before. In her grandmother's cottage, she'd learned to make hearty stews and fresh bread. But that was years ago, before the failed bonding, before her world had collapsed into survival mode. Her hands shook as she cracked eggs into a cast-iron pan. The first batch turned grey and rubbery. The porridge somehow burned on the bottom while staying raw on top. When she tried to salvage it with honey, the entire jar slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered across the stone floor, golden sweetness spreading like accusation. Marta didn't say a word. Just handed her a rag. By the time Naira carried the food to the great hall, all 4 cubs were waiting. They'd arranged themselves like a tribunal, Kale standing with arms crossed, Roan sitting with his book open but eyes watching, Lyra half hidden behind her brother, Ash swinging his legs from a chair too tall for him. Kale took one look at the blackened porridge and pushed his bowl away. "I'm not eating that." Roan sniffed the eggs without touching them. "These smell like ash and desperation." Even little Ash shook his head, disappointment clear on his young face. Only Lyra hesitantly reached for a piece of bread. She took one small bite, chewed carefully, then set it down with heartbreaking gentleness. Heat flooded Naira's cheeks. Not from the fire. From failure laid bare before children who'd already seen too many adults prove inadequate. The side door opened. Draven entered, still wearing his training leathers, dark with sweat despite the morning cold. His hair was damp, pulled back roughly. Fresh bruises colored his knuckles. Naira braced herself. For anger. For dismissal. For being sent away before she'd even unpacked. Instead, he glanced at the untouched food, then at her trembling hands where she'd gripped the serving tray too tightly. "Marta," he said, voice carrying across the hall. "Show her where we keep the dried meat and cheese. Cubs can eat that this morning." He looked at Naira then, really looked, his storm-grey eyes cataloguing details. "Did you burn yourself?" She glanced down at the fresh red mark on her forearm where she touched the iron pot handle. "It's nothing." "Marta, bring the salve." Then he disappeared through another doorway, leaving Naira standing in confused silence. Marta returned with a clay jar, roughly applying cool ointment to the burn. Her touch was harsh but thorough. "He won't hit you for mistakes," she said quietly. "The last Alpha King would have. This one's different. But the cubs won't respect weakness either. You'll need to earn your place here." "How?" "That's for you to figure out, girl." After the disastrous breakfast, Naira needed air. Needed space to think without 4 pairs of eyes tracking her every failure. She wandered the fortress grounds, boots crunching through fresh snow. Behind the east wing, she discovered something unexpected. A walled garden, completely overgrown. Dead vines strangled the iron gate. Frozen weeds pushed through cracked stone pathways. What had once been carefully tended beds now looked like a battlefield where winter had won decisively. But in the center stood a stone marker, weathered by years of harsh weather yet still readable. Luna Celine's garden, may the moonflowers bloom eternal. Everything was dead. Frost killed. Abandoned to time and grief. Naira pushed open the gate. It groaned on rusted hinges. She walked the perimeter, identifying what had once grown here, medicinal herbs her grandmother had taught her to recognize, flowers meant for ceremonies, vegetables that could survive mountain winters. In the far corner, protected by a partially collapsed wall that blocked the worst of the wind, she found something that made her heart skip. A single moonflower bulb. Dormant but alive. She knelt in the snow, carefully clearing away dead leaves and debris. The bulb was small, tough, resilient. Against all odds, it had survived 3 winters of neglect. That was Mother's garden. Naira turned sharply. Lyra stood in the gateway, her stuffed wolf clutched tight against her chest. The little girl's blonde hair caught the weak morning light. She died 3 winters ago, Lyra continued, her voice barely carrying across the frozen space. Father locked the gate after. No one's been inside since. It's beautiful, Naira said softly, meaning it. Or it was. Mother said moonflowers only bloom when there's hope. Lyra took one small step closer. Can you make them grow again? I don't know. Maybe. If I can remember what my grandmother taught me. Lyra studied her with those impossibly wide golden eyes. Ancient wariness lived in that young face. The others all said they could help. They all said they'd stay. They all left. I won't leave. Everyone says that. The little girl's voice cracked. Everyone promises. Then they see how broken we are, and they go. You're not broken. Yes, we are. Lyra's grip tightened on her toy. We're the cubs nobody wants. The motherless ones. The damaged goods. That's what the pack elders whisper when they think we can't hear. She turned and ran back toward the fortress, blonde hair streaming behind her like a flag of retreat. Naira remained kneeling in the snow, her heart aching. She looked down at the surviving moonflower bulb, this small stubborn thing that refused to die despite everything working against it. We're going to survive this, she whispered to it. Both of us. The wind howled its doubt through the dead garden. 3 weeks crawled by like wounded animals. Naira's cooking improved marginally, the porridge no longer resembled charcoal. The eggs achieved actual edibility. The cubs tolerated her presence the way one tolerates weather. Inevitable, unremarkable, occasionally unpleasant. She learned to stay invisible. To anticipate needs before they were spoken. To not ask questions. Draven remained a ghost in his own fortress, appearing only at odd hours, often covered in blood that wasn't always his own. Patrol missions, Marta explained. Border disputes. Pack justice that required the Alpha King's personal attention. Naira asked nothing. Expected nothing. Kept her head down. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning. Ash refused breakfast. Not unusual, the cubs often skipped meals. But by midday, he was vomiting into a basin, his small body convulsing with each heave. His skin turned grey. Fever spiked so high that Lyra ran screaming for Marta. The old woman tried everything in her arsenal, cold compresses soaked in mountain spring water, herb teas brewed from their dwindling stores, bone broth forced down his throat only to come back up minutes later. Nothing worked. Kale appeared in the doorway, his usual mask of indifference cracking. We need to send for the healer. The healer is 3 days' ride away, Marta snapped, wringing out another cloth. Storm blocked the mountain pass last night. He won't make it in time. Then what do we do? Roan's voice shook. His book lay forgotten on the floor. Naira knelt beside the small cub, checking his eyes, pupils dilated unevenly. His breathing came in shallow gasps. The color of his gums had shifted from healthy pink to alarming white. She lifted his small hand, examining his fingernails. Then she saw it. Faint silver burns around his mouth and on his tongue. Her grandmother's voice echoed across years. Silver poisoning shows itself in the mouth first, child. Always check the mouth. Silver poisoning, Naira whispered. Every head turned toward her. Kale moved fast, suddenly looming over her. How do you know that? She swallowed hard. The secret she'd buried. The skill deemed worthless when she'd been branded Barren. I was a healer's apprentice. Before everything. My grandmother taught me. Can you fix him? Roan demanded, his book-learned composure shattered by raw fear. Maybe. I need specific herbs. Moonroot for purging toxins, silverbane to counteract the metal, wolf's tongue to strengthen his blood. Marta's face went pale. We don't have those here. The fortress stores ran out last winter. The forest does. Naira's mind raced, cataloguing what she'd seen during her brief explorations. I've seen them growing near the East Ridge. The protected valley where snow doesn't reach as deep. It's too dangerous for a human alone. The door slammed open. Draven filled the frame, summoned from the training grounds by urgent message. His eyes went immediately to his youngest son, pale and trembling on the bed. Something terrible crossed his scarred face. What happened? Silver poisoning, my king, Marta said quickly. We don't know the source. I do. Naira held up a small wooden toy soldier, one Ash had been playing with constantly. Its paint was flaking off in patches, revealing pure silver underneath. He was chewing on this. The paint sealed the silver before, but it's wearing away. Draven's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. Can you save him? I need herbs from the forest. I need to go now. Every minute the silver stays in his system. It's too dangerous. Wolves don't hunt alone, and you can't shift. I'm not a wolf. Her voice came out harder than intended. The forest won't attack me the way it would attack a shifter in your territory. But your son will die if I don't try. Their eyes locked. Storm gray meeting defiant amber. She watched him calculate, weigh options, measure risks against the small life fading on the bed. Kale goes with you, Draven finally said. You have 2 hours before dark. After that, the mountain predators hunt. Naira and Kale ventured into the frozen forest, following deer trails through snow that came up to her knees. The eldest cub shifted into his wolf form, a lean gray adolescent, still growing into his power. His fur was darker than his father's, marked with black along his spine. He ranged ahead, breaking trail through the worst of the drifts. Naira followed his tracks, scanning the undergrowth for the precious herbs. Her grandmother's teachings came back like muscle memory. Moonroot grew near running water, silverbane preferred rocky soil, wolf's tongue favored the shade of ancient pines. They'd been searching for 30 minutes when Kale shifted back, standing naked and unconcerned in the snow. Cubs learned early that modesty meant nothing to survival. Why do you care? His voice cut through the wind. Ash is nothing to you. He's a child. That's enough. The others didn't care. Bitterness dripped from every word. They were just here for status. For father's gold. For the chance to be Luna to an alpha king. I'm not them. Prove it. Naira found the moonroot first, its distinctive red-veined leaves barely visible under a shelf of ice near a half-frozen stream. Then silverbane, growing stubborn and hardy between rocks. Finally, wolf's tongue, its thick leaves frost-covered but still viable beneath the protection of a massive pine. They returned with minutes to spare before sunset. The sky had already shifted to dangerous purple, and in the distance, Naira heard something howl that definitely wasn't a wolf. Marta had hot water boiling. Naira worked quickly, crushing the herbs with mortar and pestle, mixing them into a paste with specific ratios her grandmother had drilled into her memory. She added warm water and honey to make it palatable, then carefully fed it to Ash while the entire household watched. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Draven stood in the doorway like a statue carved from grief and stone. Marta paced. Roan sat with his hands clasped so tight his knuckles went white. Lyra cried silently into her stuffed wolf. Kale stood beside Naira, watching his youngest brother's face for any sign of change. Then, slowly, color returned to Ash's cheeks. His breathing deepened, steadied. The gray tint faded from his skin. Fever broke in a sudden sweat that soaked through his nightshirt. By midnight, he was sleeping peacefully, one small hand curled around Naira's finger. Draven stood in the doorway still, but something had shifted in his expression. When Naira finally looked up, exhausted and trembling, he simply nodded once. Thank you. Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows like he always did. But Kale remained. The hostile 14-year-old studied her for a long moment, some internal battle playing out behind his gray eyes. You saved him, he said finally. We saved him, Naira corrected. I couldn't have found those herbs without you breaking trail. For the first time since she'd arrived, the boy allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch his face. After saving Ash, something fundamental shifted in the fortress. The cubs didn't immediately embrace Naira with open arms, but the active resistance dissolved like spring ice. Ash followed her everywhere now, his small hand occasionally reaching for hers when he thought no one was watching. She'd feel the tentative touch, those tiny fingers seeking reassurance, and her heart would crack a little more each time. Lyra began appearing in doorways, watching silently as Naira worked. Then came small requests. Can you braid my hair like mother used to? The question delivered in a whisper so quiet Naira almost missed it. She didn't know how Celine had braided Lyra's hair, so she did it the way her grandmother had done hers, a simple plait woven with a strip of blue cloth. Lyra touched it reverently, then fled before Naira could see her cry. Roan started reading aloud while Naira mended clothes by the fire. He never asked if she wanted to hear. Just opened his books and shared the histories he was devouring, tales of the first shifters, wars between packs, the formation of the Northern Territories. His voice filled the silence she hadn't realized was suffocating her. Even Kale stopped glaring with quite so much intensity. He'd nod when passing her in corridors. Once, he brought her firewood without being asked. Small things. Fragile things. But things that mattered. Naira returned to Luna Celine's garden whenever she had spare moments. She cleared dead vines with her bare hands, not minding the scratches. Turned the frozen soil section by section, breaking up ice and mixing in ash from the kitchen fires to enrich the earth. Carefully tended the surviving moonflower bulb, protecting it from the worst of the wind. Lyra watched from the gateway at first, maintaining her distance like a wild animal testing safety. Then one afternoon, she ventured 3 steps inside. Mother used to sing while she gardened, the little girl said, her voice barely audible over the wind. What did she sing? Lyra hummed a melody, haunting and wordless, something ancient that predated language. It raised goosebumps on Naira's arms and made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. That's beautiful, Naira managed. Father hasn't sung since she died. Lyra moved closer, drawn by memory. None of us have. The songs died with her. Maybe they're just sleeping. Like the moonflowers. The little girl considered this seriously. Then she knelt beside Naira and began clearing debris from one of the garden beds. They worked in silence, accompanied only by the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. One night, Naira woke to the sound of agonized howling. Not the clean call of a wolf to its pack, but something broken. Raw. Devastating. She should have stayed in bed. Should have followed the rules about the Western Tower. Instead, she followed the sound through dark corridors until she reached a door standing slightly ajar. Light spilled through the gap. Inside, chaos. Draven stood in his half-shifted form, caught between man and wolf, claws extended, eyes wild with rage and grief. Furniture lay in splinters. Walls bore deep gouges from claws that had raked stone. Glass crunched under his feet from a shattered mirror. He stared at a portrait on the wall, a beautiful woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. Luna Celine. She looked kind. She looked loved. Naira should have left. Every instinct screamed to give him privacy. But something in his broken hull kept her frozen in the doorway. She died protecting them, he said without turning, somehow sensing her presence. Rival Alpha attacked during a new moon when our power was weakest. Varric wanted our territory. Wanted me dead. Wanted everything I'd built turned to ash. His voice cracked. She fought 20 wolves alone so the cubs could escape to the safe room. Held them off for an hour. They tore her apart. I'm sorry. I couldn't save her. His claws dug into his palms, drawing blood. I was on the borders, chasing a false threat Varric had planted. By the time I returned, he made a sound like something dying. I haven't fully shifted since that night. I'm afraid of what I'll become if I let go completely. Naira took a step closer, her bare feet silent on broken glass. Grief isn't weakness, Alpha King. And rage doesn't mean you're lost. He finally turned to look at her, his storm-gray eyes burning with unshed tears. How would you know? Because I've carried both. She held his gaze, unflinching. I was branded Barren and sold by my own parents. My betrothed tried to kill me when I couldn't give him cubs. I've been angry enough to want to burn the world down. Sad enough to want to stop existing. But I'm still here. Still standing. Still capable of caring about 4 motherless cubs I've known for less than a month. Why do you care? Why stay? Because someone has to. Because they deserve better than abandonment wrapped in good intentions. She moved closer still. Because maybe I deserve better than believing I'm worthless. They stood in that destroyed room for over an hour. Talking. Sharing wounds they'd both tried to bury. Draven told her about Celine, how they'd met during a territorial negotiation, how she'd softened his brutal edges, how she'd turned this war fortress into something that felt like home. Nyra told him about her grandmother, the woman who'd seen value in her when everyone else saw only failure. About the herbs and healing she'd learned in secret. About the shame of the healer's brand that had defined her entire adult life. You're not useless, he said firmly. Tell that to everyone who sold me. I'm telling you. His hand almost reached for hers, then stopped. You saved my son. You've given my cubs something I couldn't, the belief that adults might stay. I won't leave them. Don't make promises you can't keep. I'm not. Something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, recognition, the dangerous beginning of something neither could name. The next morning, Marta cornered Nyra in the kitchen, her weathered face set in hard lines. Be careful, the old woman said quietly. Of what? The king hasn't looked at anyone like that since the Luna died. The pack will notice. Not everyone will approve of a barren human catching his attention. I'm not trying to replace her. I know. Marta's expression softened fractionally. But the heart doesn't always ask permission before it decides to care. Just, don't hurt him. Don't hurt those cubs. They've had enough loss. I won't. See that you don't. Word reached Shadow Peak on a grey morning when even the wolves seemed uneasy. A messenger arrived bleeding from claw marks across his ribs, barely conscious enough to deliver his report. Alpha Varric of the Southern Cliffs was moving forces north. The name alone made Draven's expression turn to stone. Marta dropped the pot she'd been scrubbing. Even Kale, who prided himself on stoic control, went pale. His coming back, Roan whispered, his book forgotten in trembling hands. He killed Mother, Lyra said to no one, her voice empty of inflection. Ash pressed against Nyra's side, suddenly very small. The fortress transformed overnight into a war machine. Warriors drilled from dawn until collapse, their movements precise and brutal. Supply lines were reinforced, weapons sharpened, armor repaired, emergency food stores moved to secure locations. The cubs were taught emergency protocols, where to hide, how to stay silent, which tunnels led to escape. Routes. Nyra helped where she could. Rolling bandages until her fingers cramped. Preserving food in salt and smoke. Learning basic defensive positions from Marta, who moved through combat stances with surprising grace for her age. Why would he attack now? Nyra asked while grinding medicinal herbs into powder. Draven stood nearby, sharpening his blade with methodical strokes. The sound of steel on whetstone filled the hall. Because predators smell weakness. A king without a Luna. Cubs without a mother. He thinks we're vulnerable. Are you? His eyes met hers across the space. Storm gray. Unreadable. Not anymore. They came at dusk 3 weeks later, during the new moon when Shifter strength waned to its lowest ebb. Nyra was helping Ash with his letters when the warning howls began, sharp, urgent, spreading through the pack like wildfire. 50 wolves, maybe more. They'd surrounded the fortress with military precision, cutting off escape routes and reinforcement paths simultaneously. Alpha Varric himself stood at the front lines, a massive rust-colored wolf with scarred flanks and cold amber eyes that promised death. His howl cut through the mountain air like a blade through silk. Send out the king. Let's settle this like our fathers did. Alpha to alpha. Or watch your cubs burn. Draven shifted for the first time in 3 years. The transformation was agonizing to witness. Bones breaking and reforming. Skin splitting to accommodate new form. His human scream became a wolf's howl, massive and terrifying and heartbreaking all at once. When it finished, a silver-gray beast stood where the Alpha King had been. Larger than any wolf Nyra had ever seen, eyes still storm-cloud gray, scars visible even through thick fur. He charged into the darkness without hesitation. Naira moved on pure instinct. Cubs, now. She rushed all four down to the catacombs beneath the fortress, ancient tunnels carved by the first pack, lined with silver deposits that would mask their scent from enemy wolves. The air smelled of minerals and old death. Stay here. She pressed the torch into Kale's hand. No matter what you hear, you stay here. What about father? Ash cried, tears streaming down his small face. Your father is the strongest alpha in the north. He'll survive. She hoped her voice sounded more confident than she felt. What about you? Lyra grabbed her arm with surprising strength. I'll make sure of it. Naira wasn't a warrior. Had never held a real weapon before tonight. But she'd spent weeks learning the fortress layout, memorizing every corridor and hidden passage. She knew where the silver traps were stored, where oil could be poured from ramparts, where fire could create barriers. Working with Marta and 3 remaining guards, the rest had joined the battle outside. She turned Shadow Peak into a death trap. When wolves breached the outer wall, they met silver lace nets that burned their skin on contact. When they entered the courtyard, boiling oil rained down from the ramparts. When they tried the eastern gate, fire roared to life across oil-soaked ground. Outside, Draven fought like something beyond mortal. Every wolf that had died in Celine's murder, he avenged. Every cub that had cried in the night, he fought for. Every year of grief and rage channeled into teeth and claws. Varric was strong. Experienced. Cruel. But Draven was fury given form. They clashed in the snow, blood spraying across white powder in crimson arcs. Fangs tore flesh. Claws raked deep. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. A group of 5 wolves broke through Naira's defenses. They'd found a tunnel she didn't know existed. Now they were inside, heading for the catacombs with predatory focus. Naira stood alone in the corridor, holding a silver-tipped spear Marta had thrust into her hands. Her palms were slick with sweat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. You're just a human, the lead wolf snarled, lips pulling back from blood-stained fangs. I'm their mother, Naira said, and charged. She killed one, pure luck, the spear finding the gap between ribs. Another lunged and she rolled, clumsy but effective. Then they overwhelmed her. Claws ripped through her shoulder. Fangs grazed her throat, missing the artery by inches. Blood poured hot down her arm. Then Kale was there, shifted into his adolescent wolf form, fighting with desperate ferocity. Roan emerged from the shadows, using his smaller size and speed to distract and harry. Lyra, tiny but vicious, went for exposed legs and soft underbellies. Even little Ash appeared, throwing handfuls of silver dust he'd found in the army, making the enemy wolves scream. Together, they drove the invaders back. By dawn, Varric lay dead in blood-stained snow, his throat torn completely out. The surviving enemy wolves fled into the forest, leaderless and broken. But Draven was barely standing, covered in wounds that leaked red across grey fur. He collapsed into the snow, shifting back to human form with agonizing slowness. Naira ran to him, her own wounds forgotten. His blood was everywhere, soaking the ground, staining her hands, warm against the frozen air. The cubs, he gasped, eyes struggling to focus. Safe. All of them safe. You. She pressed her hand to his bleeding chest, feeling his heart beat against her palm. Still here. Why would you fight for us? Each word cost him. The answer came without thought, raw and honest. Because you were the first person who treated me like I mattered. His hand covered hers, blood mixing between their palms. The touch was gentle despite the violence surrounding them. Stay, he whispered. Not as a servant. Not as hired help. Stay. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither had courage to name yet. Around them, the fortress began counting its losses. But in that moment, kneeling in blood-stained snow with his hand covering hers, Naira understood she'd found something she'd thought impossible. She'd found home. The fortress spent 3 weeks in recovery mode. They'd won, but victory had teeth. Draven's wounds were catastrophic. Broken ribs that had punctured his lung, deep lacerations that required silver thread stitches, poison from Varric's claws that turned his blood black and his fever dangerous. Naira nursed him through it all. Fever dreams where he called for Celine, thrashing against enemies only he could see. Pain so intense he couldn't shift fully back to human without screaming. Hours where his breathing went shallow and she thought she'd lose him. She used every herb and technique her grandmother had taught her. Changed bandages hourly. Forced water down his throat when he was too weak to drink. Stayed awake for days until Marta physically dragged her away to sleep. The cubs took turns sitting vigil. Even stoic Kale read to his unconscious father, pack histories and battle accounts in a steady voice that cracked only when he thought no one was listening. During the 4th week of recovery, something miraculous happened. Lyra discovered it at dawn. The little girl's scream echoed through the fortress, high and terrified. Everyone ran, expecting attack or death or worse. Instead, they found her in the garden, pointing with a shaking hand. The first moonflower had bloomed. A single silver blossom, opening toward the dawn sky like a prayer answered. Its petals caught the light and seemed to glow from within. The scent, subtle, sweet, impossibly delicate, filled the garden like a benediction. When Draven was finally strong enough to walk, leaning heavily on Marta's shoulder, Nyra brought him to see it. He stood before the flower for a long time. Silent tears streamed down his scarred face, disappearing into his beard. Celine planted these, he said finally, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. She told me they'd bloom again when it was time to live instead of grieve. She was wise. She would have liked you. He turned to look at Nyra directly. She would have been grateful you were here for them. The words settled between them, weighted with meaning. Not everyone shared their peace. A delegation of pack elders arrived 2 days later, demanding formal audience with the Alpha King. 7 of them, dressed in ceremonial furs, faces set in disapproving lines. They gathered in the great hall. Draven sat in his carved chair, still pale but radiating authority. The cubs ranged behind him. Nyra stood to the side, as protocol demanded. Elder Morvis spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and judgment. This human has no business raising the future alphas. She cannot shift, cannot hunt, cannot defend the bloodline properly. She defended my cubs when half your warriors fled, Draven replied, his voice cold as mountain ice. She saved my youngest son's life. She brought my fortress through a siege with strategy and courage. What exactly has she failed to do? She's Barren, my king. Morvis gestured at Nyra like she was evidence of corruption. The moon goddess herself rejected her. How can she guide cubs into their wolves when she has no wolf to call? The old shame burned through Nyra. She stood silent, hands clasped, staring at the stone floor. Waiting for dismissal. For rejection. For proof that she'd always be worthless. But then Kale spoke, his young voice cutting through the hall like a blade. She's more of a mother than any wolf-born female you've paraded through here. Roan added, stepping forward with his usual careful precision. She taught me healing arts your precious pack never valued. She stayed when trained warriors ran. Lyra simply walked over and took Nyra's hand, small fingers gripping tight. Her golden eyes dared the elders to try removing her. Ash climbed into Nyra's lap and glared at the assembled wolves with pure childhood fury. Draven stood, his alpha presence filling the room until the air felt thick with power. Nyra stays. Not as a servant. Not as temporary help. As part of this family. If anyone has objections, they can challenge me directly. The silence stretched. No one moved. Good. We're done here. The elders filed out, some furious, others thoughtful, all unwilling to challenge an Alpha King who'd just killed Varric in single combat. That night, after the cubs were finally asleep, Draven found Nyra in the garden. She was tending the moonflowers by lantern light, checking soil moisture and clearing new growth. You didn't have to defend me like that, she said without looking up. Yes, I did. Your pack will never fully accept me. They'll learn. Or they'll find another pack to join. He moved closer, his shadow falling across the flowers. Nyra, I need to ask you something. And I need complete honesty. She finally looked up. All right. Do you want to stay because you have nowhere else to go? Or because this has become home? She set down her trowel, brushing dirt from her hands. When I was on that platform, I'd given up. I thought my life was over. Then you asked me one question. Did you burn yourself? Not can you breed? Not what's wrong with you? Just concern for my pain. That's not an answer. This is home. The words came out fierce. You're home. Those cubs are home. For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to prove my worth every moment. I just, and somehow that's enough. There's something I need to tell you. His expression turned serious. About the Barren diagnosis. Naira tensed, old wounds threatening to reopen. I had our healer examine the brand on your wrist. It's a forgery. The symbols are deliberately wrong. Anyone with real training would recognize it immediately. The world tilted sideways. What? You're not Barren, Naira. You never were. Someone in your former pack wanted you marked as worthless. Probably paid off those healers, or they were incompetent. Your wolf isn't broken, it's dormant from trauma. She sank onto the garden bench, mind spinning. But 3 healers confirmed. Were they pack healers? Tied to your betrothed's family? Her stomach dropped. They had been. All 3 affiliated with his bloodline. With time, with healing, with safety. Draven knelt before her, his scarred hands gentle on her knees. You could shift. You could bond. You could have everything they said you couldn't. Tears streamed down her face, rage for stolen years, relief for vindication, grief for the girl who'd believed herself broken. Why would someone do that? I don't know yet. But I have people investigating. His thumbs brushed her tears away. You were never the problem, Naira. They were. She fell forward into his arms, sobbing against his chest while he held her through the storm of emotions. Around them, moonflowers bloomed in the darkness, their silver petals glowing like hope made visible. Over the next month, Draven's network uncovered the rot buried in Naira's past. Her former betrothed, a wolf named Garrett from a prominent bloodline, had wanted to reject their bond without losing face. He'd bribed 3 healers to brand her Barren, providing him the perfect excuse. Pack law allowed rejection of a Barren mate without judgment or penalty. He'd wanted someone else. A female from a stronger family. Better connections. More political value. So he destroyed Naira instead. The evidence reached her former pack's alpha. Justice was swift and brutal. Garrett stripped of rank, exiled from pack lands, his family forced to pay blood debt to Draven's territory. But for Naira, the vindication felt hollow. She'd lost years believing herself broken. Years of shame that had carved themselves into her bones. It happened on a full moon night, 3 months after the siege. Naira was in the garden when the change began. Pain ripped through her body, bones breaking and reshaping, muscles tearing and reforming, skin splitting to accommodate something that had always lived inside her but had been buried under trauma and lies. She screamed, terrified and agonized. Then Draven was there, shifted alongside her. His massive silver-grey form pressed against her, steadying her, guiding her through it with presence and calm. When the transformation finally completed, she stood on 4 legs for the first time. A sleek silver wolf with amber eyes and moonlight-pale fur. Smaller than Draven but elegant, built for speed and endurance. The cubs howled in celebration, their voices joining in ancient harmony. The pack gathered in the courtyard, witnessing the impossible. A woman they'd been told was Barren, now standing wolf-born under the full moon. Naira threw back her head and howled. The sound came from somewhere deep and primal, a song she'd never known she could sing. She was whole. She was real. She was enough. Draven didn't make grand speeches or elaborate plans. He simply asked her one evening while they walked through the garden, moonflowers blooming silver around them. Will you be my Luna? His scarred hand took hers. Not because you're convenient. Not because the cubs need you. Because I choose you, and I want you to choose me. Yes. The answer was immediate, certain, right. The ceremony was held under the ancient oak at the edge of the fortress grounds, the same tree where Celine and Draven had bonded 20 years before. Naira wore a simple grey dress embroidered with silver moonflowers. Draven wore his ceremonial furs. The pack gathered. The cubs stood as witnesses, Kale solemn and proud, Roan recording every detail for the pack histories, Lyra clutching her stuffed wolf with tears streaming, Ash bouncing with barely contained excitement. Marta cried actual tears, wiping them away with her apron and pretending she wasn't. When they marked each other, teeth breaking skin, blood mingling, souls connecting, The bond snapped into place like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The pack howled their approval. The mountains echoed with celebration. Naira took her role as Luna seriously. She established a healing house in the fortress for any pack member who needed care. Reopened the gardens for communal use, teaching others her grandmother's knowledge. Created safe spaces for traumatized wolves, for those rejected by other packs, for anyone who needed sanctuary. The cubs thrived under her guidance. Kale began serious training for his future alpha role. Roan became the pack's official historian and scholar. Lyra discovered a gift for diplomacy and conflict resolution. Ash simply brought joy wherever he went, his laughter echoing through halls that had been silent too long. Draven slowly let go of his grief, honoring Celine's memory while building a new future. The portrait remained in the Western Tower, but the room was no longer destroyed. He visited it sometimes, telling Celine about Naira, about the cubs, about the pack they were becoming. 6 months after the bonding, Naira woke feeling strange. Nauseous. Sensitive to smells that hadn't bothered her before. The scent of cooking meat made her flee the kitchen. Strong emotions hit harder than they should. The pack healer confirmed it with a knowing smile. Twins. She was carrying twins. When she told Draven, the fierce Alpha King who'd killed countless enemies actually sat down in shock, his legs giving out. But you were dormant. Not broken. Never broken. She took his hands, placing them on her still flat stomach. We're going to have cubs, Draven. He pulled her into his arms and wept into her hair, his shoulders shaking with relief and joy and healing. The twins were born during a winter storm that shook the fortress foundations. Labor lasted 18 hours, Naira cursing Draven's bloodline, his face, and the moon goddess herself at various points. But when the healer finally placed 2 perfect cubs in her arms, everything else fell away. A boy with Draven's storm-grey eyes and a girl with Naira's amber gaze. 10 fingers each, 10 toes, healthy lungs that announced their arrival to the entire mountain range. The 4 older cubs welcomed their siblings with fierce protective love. Kale held them with surprising gentleness. Roan read them stories before they could possibly understand. Lyra sang them the lullabies Celine had once sung to her. Ash insisted on helping with everything, his small hands carefully supporting heads and checking blankets. The pack celebrated for 3 days straight. And in the garden, the moonflowers bloomed in numbers they hadn't seen in generations, covering entire beds in silver light. Years passed like water flowing downstream, inevitable, natural, right. The fortress became a haven for those rejected by other packs. The wounded found healing. The different found acceptance. The discarded found worth. Naira made sure no one ever felt the shame she'd carried. Her twins grew strong and wild, the boy becoming a fierce warrior like his father, the girl a gifted healer like her mother. The original 4 cubs became powerful wolves in their own right, each finding their path and purpose. Draven ruled with strength tempered by compassion, his Luna always at his side. They were partners in every sense, disagreeing, compromising, supporting, loving. They had 40 good years together. When Naira died at 64, it was peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her silver hair spread across the pillow. Her hand held in Draven's. She simply didn't wake up one morning. Slipped away between one breath and the next. Draven buried her beneath the ancient oak where they'd bonded, next to the spot he'd reserved for himself years before. At her funeral, every pack member brought a moonflower. By the time they finished, her grave was buried in silver blossoms that glowed in the twilight. Draven lived 3 more years, never taking another mate. He visited her grave daily, telling her about pack business, about the Grand Cub's achievements, about everything she was missing. When he finally joined her, it was during a full moon. He shifted one last time, howled his grief and love to the sky, then lay down beside her grave and didn't rise again. But their legacy lived on. In the healing house that still stood, now run by their daughter. In the pack laws they'd established, worth is not determined by what you can produce, but by the love you choose to give. In the 6 children they'd raised together, 4 adopted by circumstance, 2 born from their bond. In the moonflowers that bloomed eternal. Spring returned to Shadow Peak. The current alpha, Kale's daughter, bearing both Draven's grey eyes and Naira's fierce heart, walked through the garden with her own cubs, 3 little ones who chased butterflies and laughed without knowing fear. Tell us the story again, Mama, the smallest one begged. She knelt in the garden that Naira had restored, surrounded by silver moonflowers that had spread across every bed. Once, there was a woman who was told she was worthless. Her own parents sold her at a marketplace on the coldest night of winter. That's sad, one cub whispered. It was. But then a lonely alpha king with 4 motherless cubs bought her freedom. Not because he wanted property. Because he saw someone who deserved better. What happened then? She became the greatest Luna the Northern Territories had ever known. She taught us that pack is chosen, not born. That worth is inherent, not earned. That home is where you're seen completely and loved anyway. The cubs listened, wide-eyed, as the story unfolded. The poison and the herbs, the garden and the siege, the love that grew in soil everyone said was barren. Is the story true? The oldest asked. Every word. She touched the memorial stone they'd placed in the garden center, marking where Naira had first found that single surviving moonflower bulb. And the moonflowers still bloom to remind us. Around them, silver petals caught the spring sunlight. The pack howled in the distance, a sound of joy, of family, of home. And somewhere beyond sight, 2 wolves ran together through eternal forests, finally at peace. Friends, thank you for journeying with Naira through her transformation from rejected and sold to beloved Luna and mother. Her story reminds us that our worth is never determined by those who fail to see it. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more tales of love, redemption, and found family. Share in the comments, what did you think of Naira's journey? Which moment resonated most with you? And remember, like the moonflowers that bloomed against all odds, you too can rise from the hardest soil. Your worth was always there, waiting to be recognized. Hit that like button if you believed in Naira's strength, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, may you find your pack, and may your garden always bloom.